Ngozi was excited as she walked into the university on the first day of the new semester. The sun was shining brightly, and the campus was buzzing with the energy of students eager to learn. Ngozi was one of the best students in her class. She loved reading her books and dreamed of becoming a lawyer so she could fight for justice and protect the rights of the people. As Ngozi sat in her first lecture, she noticed a new professor at the front of the room. His name was Professor Amadi. He was tall, with a warm smile, and all the students seemed to like him. He had a way of making everyone laugh, and he told stories that made the lessons fun. But as the class went on, Ngozi started to feel a little uncomfortable. Professor Amadi kept looking at her, smiling in a way that made her feel strange. She tried to focus on her notes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After class, Professor Amadi asked Ngozi to stay behind. "You are a very smart girl, Ngozi," he said, smiling. "I think you could be the best student in this university." Ngozi blushed and thanked him, but she felt uneasy. She quickly gathered her books and left the classroom, hoping she was just imagining things. But deep down, Ngozi knew that this semester was going to be different, and not in a good way. As the days went by, Ngozi noticed that Professor Amadi was paying more and more attention to her. In class, he always seemed to call on her to answer questions, and he often praised her in front of the other students. At first, Ngozi thought he was just trying to encourage her because she was a good student. But soon, his attention became uncomfortable. He would stop her in the hallway to talk, and he even asked her to come to his office to discuss her future. Ngozi didn't like the way he looked at her, like she was special in a way that wasn't about her grades. One day, Professor Amadi gave Ngozi a note after class. "Meet me in my office after school," it said. Ngozi's heart sank. She didn't want to go, but she didn't want to upset him either. He was a professor, after all. When Ngozi arrived at Professor Amadi's office, he invited her in and closed the door behind her. He started by asking about her studies, but then the conversation took a turn. "You know, Ngozi," he said, leaning in closer, "I can help you get the highest grades in this class. All you have to do is be nice to me." Ngozi felt her stomach twist. She knew exactly what he meant, and she didn't like it one bit. She quickly made an excuse and left his office, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked away, Ngozi realized that Professor Amadi wasn't just being nice. He was trying to manipulate her. She knew she had to be careful, but she didn't know what to do. All she knew was that she had to find a way to protect herself. Ngozi's worries grew after her meeting with Professor Amadi. She tried to avoid him as much as possible, but he always seemed to find a way to talk to her. She began to notice that her grades in his class were slipping, even though she was working just as hard as before. One day, Ngozi overheard some of her classmates talking in the hallway. "I don't know how she does it," one girl said. "I just did what Professor Amadi asked, and I got an A on my last paper." Ngozi felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumours about Professor Amadi and his strange way of helping certain students, but she never thought it was true. Now, she realised that he was trying to do the same thing to her. That evening, Ngozi sat in her room, thinking about what she had heard. She knew that if she didn't do what Professor Amadi wanted, her grades would continue to drop. But she also knew that giving in to him wasn't an option. As she thought about what to do, Ngozi remembered her best friend, Ada. Ada had been acting strangely lately, and Ngozi wondered if she had gone through something similar. Ngozi decided to talk to Ada the next day and see if she could help. But deep down, Ngozi was scared. She was scared that she might fail, scared that she wouldn't be able to stop Professor Amadi, and scared that things would only get worse. The next day, Ngozi found Ada sitting alone under a tree on campus. She looked sad and worried, just like Ngozi had been feeling. Ngozi sat down beside her and took a deep breath. "Ada, can I talk to you about something?" she asked. Ada nodded, but she didn't look up. Ngozi hesitated, not sure how to start. "Have you ever felt like someone was trying to make you do something you didn't want to do?" Ngozi asked carefully. Ada's eyes filled with tears and she looked at Ngozi. "Yes," she whispered. "It happened to me too, with Professor Amadi." Ngozi felt a lump in her throat. "What did he do?" she asked softly. Ada wiped her eyes and told Ngozi everything. She explained how Professor Amadi had also asked her to meet in his office, how he had promised to help her with her grades if she did what he wanted. Ada had been too scared to refuse, and she gave in to his demands. She had felt ashamed and powerless ever since. "I wish I had been brave enough to say no," Ada said, her voice trembling. "But I was afraid of failing, and I didn't know what else to do." Ngozi reached out and held Ada's hand. "It's not your fault," she said. "He's the one who's wrong. We can't let him keep doing this." Ada looked at Ngozi with hope in her eyes. "But what can we do?" she asked. "He's so powerful, and nobody will believe us." Ngozi felt determined. "We'll find a way," she said firmly. "We'll gather evidence, and we'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Ada nodded, but Ngozi could see the fear in her eyes. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that they couldn't let Professor Amadi continue hurting other students. They had to be strong, even if it meant risking everything. Despite their resolve, things didn't get easier for Ngozi and Ada. Ngozi continued to struggle in Professor Amadi's class. No matter how hard she studied, her grades kept slipping. It was clear that Professor Amadi was punishing her for rejecting him, and there was nothing she could do about it. One day, Ngozi received her first major test back from Professor Amadi. Her heart sank when she saw the grade, an F. She knew the material inside and out, so how could she have failed? Ngozi felt a wave of frustration and anger. She knew this wasn't about her knowledge, it was about power. Professor Amadi was using his position to control her, just like he had done with Ada, and who knows how many other girls. But Ngozi wasn't ready to give up. She remembered her plan to gather evidence against him. She and Ada would have to be careful, but they had to find a way to prove what was really happening. As Ngozi sat in her room that evening, staring at her failing grade, she knew that she was in for a tough fight. She felt scared, but she also felt a spark of determination. She wouldn't let Professor Amadi win. She would find a way to stop him, no matter how difficult it was. But for now, the road ahead seemed dark and full of challenges, and Ngozi could only hope that she had the strength to keep going. One afternoon, while Ngozi was walking across the campus, she overheard a group of girls talking near the library. They were speaking in hushed voices, but Ngozi caught a few words that made her stop in her tracks. "Professor Amadi, same thing happened to me. And what can we do?" Ngozi's heart raced. She approached the group cautiously, and when they noticed her, the girls fell silent. "I couldn't help but overhear," Ngozi said gently. "Are you talking about Professor Amadi?" The girls exchanged nervous glances, and finally one of them nodded. Her name was Chinyere, and she looked just as frightened as Ngozi had felt. "He's been doing this to a lot of us," Chinyere admitted. "We're too scared to speak out because we don't want to fail." Ngozi felt a mix of relief and anger. She wasn't alone, there were others who had gone through the same thing. But the thought of how many girls had suffered because of Professor Amadi made her blood boil. "Maybe we can help each other," Ngozi suggested. "If we work together, we might be able to stop him." The girls seemed hesitant at first, but Chinyere stepped forward. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's so powerful, and we're just students." Ngozi took a deep breath. "We need to gather evidence," she said. "If we can prove what he's been doing, we can take it to the university authorities. They'll have to listen to us if we have proof." The other girls nodded slowly, and Ngozi felt a spark of hope. Together, they could be strong. Together, they might have a chance to stop Professor Amadi and protect other students from his abuse. Ngozi and the other girls spent the next few days coming up with a plan. They knew they had to be careful, so they decided to keep everything a secret. Only those who had been affected by Professor Amadi could be involved. They couldn't risk anyone finding out before they had enough evidence. Ngozi and Ada took the lead in organising the group. They decided that the first step would be to record conversations with Professor Amadi. If they could get him to say something inappropriate or admit to what he had done, they would have the proof they needed. One of the girls, Amara, was brave enough to volunteer to be the first to record a conversation. She had a small voice recorder that she could hide in her bag. The plan was for her to visit Professor Amadi's office and try to get him to talk about what he had done to her. The day Amara was supposed to meet with Professor Amadi, the group of girls gathered in a quiet corner of the library. They were all nervous, but they knew this was their best chance to stop him. As they waited for Amara to return, Ngozi felt a mix of fear and determination. This plan was risky, and if anything went wrong, they could all be in serious trouble. But she also knew they couldn't back down now. Finally, after what felt like hours, Amara returned. She looked shaken but relieved. "I did it," she said, holding up the voice recorder. "I got him to talk." The girls gathered around as Amara played the recording. Sure enough, Professor Amadi's voice could be heard, making inappropriate comments and hinting at the things he had done. Ngozi felt a surge of hope. They had their first piece of evidence. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. They would need more recordings, more proof, and more courage to bring Professor Amadi to justice. Ngozi knew it was her turn next. She had to be the one to confront Professor Amadi. With the voice recorder hidden in her bag, she nervously made her way to his office. She had a plan, but that didn't stop her heart from pounding in her chest. When she knocked on the door, Professor Amadi greeted her with his usual smile. "Ngozi, come in," he said warmly. "It's good to see you." Ngozi forced a smile and sat down, trying to act natural. She needed to get him talking, but it was hard to hide how scared she was. "I wanted to talk about my grades," Ngozi began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been working really hard, but I'm still failing your class. Is there anything I can do to improve?" Professor Amadi leaned back in his chair and looked at her closely. "You're a smart girl, Ngozi," he said, his tone smooth. "I'm sure we can find a way to help you, but you have to understand that sometimes it's not just about studying. Sometimes you need to show that you're willing to cooperate." Ngozi's stomach turned, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you mean by cooperate?" she asked, hoping to get him to say something incriminating. Professor Amadi smiled in a way that made Ngozi feel sick. "You know what I mean," he said softly. "If you're willing to be nice to me, I can make sure your grades improve, but if you keep resisting, things might get worse for you." Ngozi felt like her heart was going to explode, but she nodded and quickly made an excuse to leave. As soon as she was out of his office, she hurried to find Ada and the others. When Ngozi played the recording for them, the room was filled with a tense silence. They had the proof they needed, clear evidence of Professor Amadi's threats and manipulation. But as they listened, Ngozi couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into dangerous territory. They had caught him in the trap, but now they had to figure out what to do next. Ngozi and her friends were relieved that they had captured Professor Amadi's words on tape, but they knew this wasn't enough. They needed more evidence to show that this wasn't just about one bad professor. It was about a much bigger problem at the university. As they continued to gather stories from other girls, they began to see a pattern. Professor Amadi wasn't the only one involved. There were other professors who had been doing the same thing for years, and some of the university's officials were covering it up. Ngozi felt a growing sense of dread. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. She realized that bringing down Professor Amadi might not be enough to stop the corruption. They had to expose everyone involved, but that would be incredibly dangerous. One evening, Ngozi was going through some old university records she had borrowed from the library. She found a file that mentioned an investigation from several years ago involving another professor. The case had been quietly closed, and the professor had retired early with full benefits. It was clear that someone had protected him. Ngozi knew that if they were going to succeed, they would need more help. They needed someone who knew the system and could guide them through the next steps. That night, as Ngozi lay in bed, she felt overwhelmed by the darkness of what they were facing. She knew they were up against powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy them if they got too close to the truth. But Ngozi also knew that they couldn't stop now. They had come too far, and too many people were counting on them. They had to keep going, even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, Ngozi found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a note written in neat handwriting. "I know what you're doing. Be careful. Meet me at the old mango tree behind the library at sunset." Ngozi's heart raced as she read the note. Who could this be? Could they be trusted? She didn't know, but she felt like she had no choice. She needed all the help she could get. That evening, just as the sun was setting, Ngozi made her way to the old mango tree. The campus was quiet, and she felt a chill in the air. She waited, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. After a few minutes, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was an older man with grey hair and a kind face. Ngozi recognised him. It was Dr. Okoro, a senior lecturer who had been at the university for many years. He was known for being quiet and keeping to himself. "Ngozi, you're very brave," Dr. Okoro said softly. "I've heard about what you and the other girls are doing. I want to help you, but you must be careful. The people you're up against are very powerful." Ngozi felt a mix of relief and suspicion. "Why do you want to help us?" she asked. Dr. Okoro sighed. "Because I've seen too much," he said. "Years ago, I tried to stop something like this from happening, but I was silenced. I was too afraid to fight back, and I've regretted it ever since. But now, seeing you and the other girls, I believe it's time to make things right." He handed Ngozi a folder filled with documents. These are records of complaints that were made against several professors over the years. They were all covered up by the university administration. This will help you show that this is a systemic problem. Ngozi took the folder, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Dr. Okoro nodded. "But be careful," he warned. "These people will do anything to protect themselves. You need to be smart and stay one step ahead." The next few days were tense for Ngozi and her friends. They now had enough evidence to make a strong case against Professor Amadi and the other corrupt officials at the university. But as they prepared to take the next step, strange things started happening. Ngozi received an anonymous text message one morning. "Stop what you're doing or you'll regret it." She showed the message to Ada, who looked just as worried as Ngozi felt. "That's not all," Ada said quietly. "I think someone's been following me. I keep seeing the same man near my dorm, watching me." Ngozi felt a knot form in her stomach. Whoever was behind this was trying to scare them into giving up. But Ngozi knew they couldn't stop now. They were so close to exposing the truth. That evening, Ngozi and Ada went to the library to meet with the other girls. They needed to decide what to do next. But when they arrived, they found that some of the girls had already backed out. They were too scared of what might happen if they continued. Ngozi understood their fear, but it also made her angry. They were so close to justice, and now it felt like everything was falling apart. As Ngozi sat down with the remaining girls, she tried to stay calm. "We can't let them win," she said firmly. "We've worked too hard to stop now. We have to keep going no matter what." The girls nodded, but Ngozi could see the fear in their eyes. She knew they were all scared, and she couldn't blame them. But she also knew that they couldn't let fear control them. Ngozi took a deep breath. They had come too far to turn back now. They had to stay strong, even if it meant facing their worst fears. As the threats continued, things only got worse. Ngozi's grades in all her classes began to suffer, not just in Professor Amadi's class. She was accused of cheating on a test she hadn't even taken yet. It was clear that someone was trying to ruin her reputation and force her to quit. Ngozi was frustrated and scared, but she refused to give up. She knew that this was all part of their plan to silence her, but the final straw came when Ada was attacked. One evening, as Ada was walking back to her dorm, 2 men approached her. They grabbed her and threatened her, telling her to make sure Ngozi stopped what she was doing. They didn't hurt her badly, but the message was clear. If Ngozi didn't stop, things would get much worse. When Ngozi heard what had happened, she was furious. How could they do this to her friend? Ada was shaken and scared, and Ngozi felt guilty for dragging her into this mess. But instead of scaring Ngozi into giving up, the attack made her even more determined. She couldn't let these people get away with what they were doing. They had gone too far, and it was time to take action. Ngozi decided that it was time to go to the police. She had gathered enough evidence, and she knew that they couldn't handle this on their own anymore. But she also knew that going to the police would be risky. There was no guarantee that they would be taken seriously, and if the wrong people found out, they could be in even more danger. But Ngozi knew that they had no other choice. It was time to make their move, and she could only hope that they were ready for what was coming next. Ngozi and her friends knew that the only way to stop Professor Amadi and the others was to expose them publicly. They couldn't let this corruption continue any longer. They decided to confront them at a big university event where everyone would be watching. Ngozi and the girls met with Inspector Ikenna, a local police officer who had a reputation for being fair and just. When they showed him the evidence they had gathered, he was shocked but supportive. "You're very brave," he told them. "We'll make sure justice is served." Inspector Ikenna helped them plan the confrontation. They would reveal the evidence at the event and ensure that the university officials couldn't deny what had been happening. But Ngozi knew that this was a dangerous move. If something went wrong, their lives could be ruined. The night before the event, Ngozi could hardly sleep. She kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if the university tried to cover it up again? What if the people behind this tried to hurt them? But every time she started to feel scared, she remembered Ada and the other girls who had suffered because of Professor Amadi. She couldn't let fear stop her now. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for all the girls who had been hurt. The next day, Ngozi and her friends stood together, ready to face whatever was coming. As they walked into the event, Ngozi felt a mixture of fear and determination. They had come too far to turn back now. When the time came, Ngozi stepped forward, holding the evidence in her hand. Her heart was pounding, but she knew this was the moment they had been working towards. She took a deep breath and began to speak, revealing the truth about what had been happening at the university. The room was silent as Ngozi spoke, and she could feel the tension in the air. She knew that what happened next would change everything. The room was filled with students, professors, and university officials. As Ngozi spoke, revealing the evidence she and the other girls had gathered, the crowd began to murmur in shock. The evidence was undeniable: recordings of Professor Amadi's threats, documents showing the cover-ups, and testimonies from the victims. Professor Amadi, who had been standing at the back of the room, looked pale and shaken. He tried to interrupt Ngozi, but Inspector Ikenna stepped forward, silencing him with a stern look. "This is a serious matter," Inspector Ikenna said, his voice firm. "We have evidence of wrongdoing that cannot be ignored. The police will conduct a full investigation, and those responsible will be held accountable." Ngozi could see the fear in Professor Amadi's eyes. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, like he knew his time was up. But Ngozi also knew that this wasn't just about him. The entire system of corruption needed to be exposed. As the evidence was presented, some of the university officials tried to deny their involvement. But the crowd wasn't fooled. Students began to shout, demanding justice, and the atmosphere in the room grew tense. Ngozi's heart was racing. This was the moment they had been working towards, but it was also the most dangerous part. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. If they weren't careful, everything could fall apart. But as she looked around the room, Ngozi saw that she wasn't alone. Her friends were standing beside her, and the other students were on their side. They had the truth on their side, and they weren't going to back down. The confrontation was intense, with accusations flying back and forth. But Ngozi stood her ground, knowing that they had done the right thing. They had exposed the truth, and now it was up to the authorities to take action. As the event came to a close, Ngozi felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had made it this far, but she knew that the fight wasn't over yet. There would be more challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them, knowing that she had done everything she could to bring justice to Umunze University. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Ngozi and her friends. The news of the confrontation spread quickly across the campus and the town of Umunze. Everyone was talking about what had happened at the university, and for the first time, people were starting to ask questions. Inspector Ikenna began a formal investigation, and it wasn't long before more evidence of corruption surfaced. Several professors and university officials were implicated, and they were suspended from their positions while the investigation continued. Ngozi felt a sense of relief, but she also knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation would take time, and there was still a lot of work to be done to ensure that justice was served. But she was proud of what they had accomplished. They had taken a stand, and their voices had been heard. As Ngozi walked across the campus, she noticed that people were looking at her differently. Some looked at her with admiration, others with fear. But Ngozi didn't care about that. She knew that she had done the right thing, and that was all that mattered. Ada and the other girls were also starting to feel more hopeful. They knew that things wouldn't change overnight, but they had taken the first step. They had shown that it was possible to stand up against injustice, even when the odds were stacked against them. One evening, as Ngozi sat in her room, she received a call from Dr. Okoro. "I'm proud of you, Ngozi," he said. "You've done something truly remarkable. But you must stay vigilant. The people you've exposed won't give up easily. They'll try to fight back, and you need to be ready." Ngozi nodded, even though Dr. Okoro couldn't see her. She knew he was right. The battle wasn't over yet, and there were still many challenges ahead. But Ngozi also knew that she had the strength to keep fighting. She had come too far to back down now.